Ladies and gentlemen, honorable diplomatic corps that I see is here, especially a specific welcome to His Excellency Ambassador Yamazaki of Japan. I'll address your support in a moment, but it's a very great personal pleasure and honor to welcome Izumi Nakamitsu to us here at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. Izumi Nakamitsu, as you will see, holds a very high-level office in the UNDP and works as well closely with the new SG António Guterres. She will tell us about her work, but I have to introduce her also by saying that she is a dear old friend of Sweden, and dare I say of me personally. When you came 20 years ago, in and out, maybe not that long, but it's a while ago already. And you worked here for a while at the International Institute of Democracy and Electoral Assistance. And since then, of course, you had a fantastic career, but you've retained a little bit from your time here, one of which, if I dare say, is a Swedish husband and two wonderful children. In this audience, I will allow myself to include that. But you went on, among other things, back to Japan, where you taught international relations at one of Tokyo's universities, and you were an advisor to the Foreign Ministry and to JICA. And I mention it because in that way you also placed yourself in a very strong tradition of Japanese international civil servants and diplomacy. And one of the persons we share very good memory of is Sadako Ogata, who in many ways embodied a fantastic tradition in Japanese work for the United Nations. And it's also, of course, in this context that I recognize the gracious support of the Japanese Foreign Ministry to make this event possible. Ambassador Yamazaki, very much thank you, and I know that we will have the pleasure of having you here again on Friday when we will be addressing one of the tough issues on Korea. But now to the issues and to you. I do not need to say anything about the world except to say that it's become so complex, so dangerous, with even the international rule of law at threat, a different world where sometimes you think neither facts nor norms nor accountability matter. Izumi Nakamitsu, please give us some perspectives from your angle.
Thank you very much, Mats, for that introduction. It's really wonderful to be here. I do consider Sweden as my second home, so it's almost speaking at home. I really appreciate Swedish also position at the United Nations. Sweden is very often a very strong supporter of many of our initiatives when we want to actually, induce changes and reforms at the UN. And you're now on the Security Council together with my own country, Japan. So thank you very much for this opportunity to basically, touch base and have my early sort of impressions of, what did they say, 70 days, I think, since the new Secretary-General António Guterres has taken his post. Great expectations, I must say. Just this past weekend, I was at a place called Green Tree, where the UN people often go for retreat meeting. There, the Secretary-General organized a retreat on his top priority agenda, prevention. So I spent 2.5 days there, and then I went to Copenhagen for a conference hosted by the Danish government, but also co-organized by UN Secretariat, OCHA, Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, together with my office in UNDP and the World Bank. I would touch on some of those issues, but first, how do we look at the world today? Let me just start from there. Because that really is in the broader background of why the Secretary-General is trying to put his agenda of prevention. The first point I want to say is that I don't think we should forget that we have actually made a lot of progress. The fact that economic growth still continues, the poverty, extreme poverty, has been halved, and basic social indicators are actually improving, education, health, etc. We really should not lose sight of these achievements that we have collectively made. And then I would like to argue that the United Nations was at the center of that, together with partners in the bilateral world and also civil society partners. But also the reality is that lots of people are still left behind, which is why the SDG Agenda 2030 has the catchwords, the slogan, "No one to be left behind." And unfortunately, probably the globalization, which is an unstoppable trend, probably have contributed or is contributing still to growing inequalities in the world. And there are global trends or mega trends we always talk about, and I'm sure in this part of the world, very strong interest exists, and you are actually at the forefront. Climate change, how to tackle the climate change impact, various scarcities in resources, food, water, natural resources, rapid urbanization, and the massive human mobility. I like to use the word human mobility because it's not just the refugee movements and asylum seekers, but also regular and irregular migration movements, massive trends. And all these mega trends, I think, are now testing our global institutions, international governance systems and institutions, including the United Nations. We are all being tested by those mega trends. Now, turning to the sort of world of conflict, the world that I've been working in, I think it's safe to say that most conflicts are still internal. But those internal conflicts have really taken a very serious, complicated and complex turns. Those internal conflicts have the root causes in various internal problems, including sometimes sectarian divide, exclusion and marginalization of certain groups within the society. I think inequality is a big issue, competition over power and resources, bad governance, weak institutions still continues to be at the center of those internal conflicts. But it has become much more complex and complicated because those internal conflicts very quickly take regional and also international overtones, and therefore it has become really very difficult to resolve. And one symbolic thing that we are witnessing every day is how difficult it is for all of us to solve the conflict in Syria. And part of the global institutions and the problem with it is the Security Council that continues to be unable to find a solution for different reasons, but the division between some of the superpowers in the Security Council is a big reason for it. So the consequence is that conflicts today protract. They don't get solved. I think we are beginning to call it at the UN in New York, the fact that the conflict actually are continuing for many years. It is now called, a little bit phrased as new normal. The end consequence of that, I think, is very much talked about. The average length of displacement, conflict-related displacement, is now around 17 years. And if you put all of the displacement, it's actually up to 26 years, according to UNHCR. Average length of emergency humanitarian appeal is now seven years. So you cannot call it emergency operation anymore. And 80% of humanitarian aid actually are going to protracted situations. So the situation around conflict and the consequence, therefore, of humanitarian picture have really changed in the past 5-7 years, I would say. And also, not only today's conflict protracts, they also seem to become more brutal. Really absolutely shocking scenes that we see in places like Syria again, Iraq by ISIS, but also in South Sudan. It's really unspeakable. And that's all exacerbated by terrorism, violent extremism, but also, I would say, cross-border or transnational organized crimes. All these factors are now contributing to the brutalization of conflicts that we are witnessing in today's world. I think one of the biggest challenges that the UN today has, it's not just the UN, it's the international community, is the threat to the norms, the universal norms that we have been working on and developing for the past 100 years or so. Now those international universal norms are being ignored, not respected. The international humanitarian law really is, the origin is even the wars should have rules. And then we have successfully developing those norms, but now it is being eroded. The threats obviously are coming from parties to the conflicts, not just the state actors, but obviously non-state actors. So here I think in a normative development area, we need really to put our heads together and then think about what are the things that we should be doing to not just protect the norms, but also restore in certain areas. So in all of these global contexts, I think we, the international institutions, there's some key developments. I think in the past 10-15 years or so, we, the international organizations, also have become multi-layered, more complex. It's not just the UN. UN still is the universal organization with the full membership, but they are now, very important regional organizations, IFIs, very important for the cause that we are collectively trying to achieve, military alliances like NATO, etc. So we need to work very much in partnership with those institutions. That would require that we have to understand how each others operate. So it has become a little bit complicated for us to manage the partnerships. And then someone said actually at the retreat over the weekend that we don't really have in the UN as part of our DNA the partnership. We still operate in the sort of little, world called the United Nations on the illusion that we are at the center of the world. Increasingly, that is not the case. I think also the second point here is that the world today, especially in the area of SDGs, we need to figure out how to work with the private sector and civil society. And again, the UN is not necessarily good at this. We need to have a new approaches and new strategies to mobilize and work with the private sector. And the third point is what I already touched on a little bit, which is the Security Council. The divisions among some of the key members, but also it does not really reflect today's power balance as we see it in the global community. And that still remains a big issue when we need to actually work with some of the emerging superpowers. We have to think through how we might be able to make the UN, not just in the Security Council, but the United Nations bodies, more reflective of the new power balance in the world. Actually, there is something that Security Council members often say, half jokingly, but it is actually true. The only good decision that the Council made in 2016 was to decide on Mr. Guterres' appointment. So, against this background, I think there are many people who are beginning to ask, so what's the state of multilateralism in today? Some people are even saying that is multilateralism under threat? Is it dead? Is it going to be a really difficult picture? I mean, the European countries are also going through elections. We saw what happened in the United States. Much of the US positions vis-à-vis the UN is unclear. And so the Secretary General does not want to be too alarmist. I think we need to find a way to work with the new administration, but a lot of things remain unclear. There are a couple of things. I'm a born optimist. Actually, if you're working with the UN, you have to be an optimist. You should not work for the UN if you're a pessimist. I actually do see some opportunities, or maybe crisis turned into opportunities. Let me just put here three things. The first is that between 2015 and last year up to now, the UN multilateralism have managed to produce a lot of really useful global policy frameworks, which presents a huge opportunity for us to tackle all these challenges that I've just put forward to you. I mean, of course, SDGs, the most important one. SDG, for me, is actually the international community's vision for the globalized world. This is how we will actually turn the globalization into a positive force and then try to mitigate the negative impact of globalization. We have the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. We have the Paris Treaty. And I would also add here, very importantly, the whole outcomes that we have achieved in the World Humanitarian Summit. Much of them are still being implemented. It's not the end results of it. It was a huge, important step forward. But I think all these things put together, I think we do have a really important policy frameworks in most of those areas. And I will come back to the very important mutually reinforcing framework vis-à-vis the SDGs, which is called Sustaining Peace Resolution. I will come back and talk about that a little bit because I think it is also quite relevant to what we want to discuss today. So the second, this is more of a crisis turned into an opportunity, is the whole area in which I had actually a huge privilege to work very closely on, which is the refugee and migration crisis-related issues. Actually, I am still doing it. I will be handing over my special advisor to the Secretary General on follow-up to the UN Summit on Refugee and Migration as of 20th of March. I'm handing this over to Ms. Louise Arbour, SG has just announced her appointment last week, and she will be taking over her position on Monday next week. So until then, I'm still doing it. But what I saw in this role, and by the way, this was the second job, so I was doing two jobs with one salary. So it's been very intense past 5 months. When I saw this in this whole area, was that the crisis that unfolded in many parts of the world, in fact, if I could put it this way, pushed the member states to come together at the General Assembly summit level last year on the 19th of September to start having this issue at the multilateral forum. Refugees, of course, we have the 51 Convention. There is a protection framework. But on the migration issue, this is the first time that the international migration came to the United Nations. What has happened on 19th of September last year was the adoption of something called New York Declaration on large movements of refugees and migrants. In that declaration, the member states' entire membership of the United Nations agreed to form two global compacts, one on the refugee side, to make sure that the refugee response will be much more comprehensive. And that track will be led by UNHCR, and the work is progressing. And on the migration track, the member states have also agreed that in 2018, they will organize an intergovernmental conference to adopt a global compact on international migration. Actually, there is a long name, safe, orderly, and regular migration. Now, this is actually quite significant. I think the member states realize that it would be much better to discuss these issues at the multilateral level rather than try to resolve either at the regional level or bilaterally. That the member states wanted to have some sort of a guiding document, a compact, so that migration movements, which has become massive in the past several years, will have some sort of rules. What I keep saying at the UN, and actually the member states have successfully negotiated the modalities resolution in the UN. Everyone thought that this will be really delayed because it's so sensitive. Actually, the member states kept the deadline and then managed to conclude that part of the negotiation on time. So it really shows that they have realized the value of multilateralism in a very difficult, challenging issues. It will be a huge test for multilateralism because if we do not succeed, then they will again go back to bilateral solutions or regional solutions, and that would not be ideal. Now, on this, I think the UN will probably have the next 10 years, 20 years, very important and strategic engagement on this issue. Very much in the way that the UN, for the first time, started to tackle the climate change issues in the 80s. And we kept the engagement over the years, all the way to Paris, and then beyond. So this is the beginning for the UN on international, if I could actually put it this way, mobility, human mobility issues, which will be a few of those global megatrends that we will need to have a strategic solutions or management of. Now, the third thing, let me just touch on the sustaining peace resolution, because this is also, for the kinds of work that I do in the UN, a hugely important one. This is adopted simultaneously by the General Assembly and the Security Council, the two identical resolutions. And this is clearly phrased as a mutually reinforcing with SDGs. It does not actually try to redefine or give new definitions to the peace-building discourse, but it provides further clarifications and, if you will, expanded scope of peace-building. What do I mean by that? This is the first time in the General Assembly that activities aimed at preventing the outbreak, continuation, escalation, and recurrence of violent conflict should be a priority agenda for the UN. If you remember when the Peacebuilding Commission was created, the General Assembly tried to include the prevention bit, and they did not succeed. But with this resolution now, before the conflict, prevention is a very important agenda, as well as, of course, longer-term peace building post-conflict. So the time frame for us has become before, during, and post-conflict. And for us, I mean, for me especially, the kinds of work that we do, this is a very important breakthrough in terms of a policy and conceptual framework. And it requires a very comprehensive and coordinated, coherent approach, tackling all sorts of things, including political processes, mediation, facilitation, of course, preventative diplomacy, of course, safety and security, protection of civilians by peace operations, etc. But also, very importantly, rule of law, human rights type of work, social services delivered by national and local governments, supported by us, core government functions to be really restored and maintained, and of course, important development aspect of it is economic revitalization and livelihood type of thing. So very comprehensive agenda, really framed in complementarity with SDGs. So put those sustaining peace resolution and SDGs together, it gives a very important framework for the Secretary-General's priority agenda of prevention. Now, so what now? What is needed? And I'm going to quote some of what the SGs have been saying. I mean, I think it's very clear that policy frameworks are there for us. These policies really capture, I think, the interconnected nature of today's crisis with humanitarian, with human rights, and also, very importantly, development discourse. And these really guide us to take much more comprehensive and coherent approaches in tackling all these very difficult challenges. But this means that we have to also change. This is what the SG said. We have to make the corresponding changes to our culture, strategy, structures, and operations. What he means is that serious reforms need to be addressing the fragmentation in policy, strategy, programming approaches, operational capacities. What is interesting about the United Nations is that we actually do have a lot of capacity if you look at it as a system, but they are all very often fragmented. My role, for example, in the migration portfolio was to pull this all together. Migration, of course, capacities are very much scattered around the UN system. IOM, that have now entered into the UN system as a related organization, has an enormous policy and technical expertise and operational capacities around the world. DESA has population division. There's a lot of good work on statistics. Smuggling, etc., is dealt with by UNODC based in Vienna. And ILO has been doing something really interesting, very important on labor migration aspects of it. And of course, Office of Human Rights has been doing very important normative human rights work related to human rights of migrants. But they're all scattered around. So we need to make sure that various capacities on different portfolios that UN carries will be put together to the best use. And that's why the Secretary-General has already, on the first day in his office, launched a couple of reform processes. So the 3rd of January, he comes in, he issued memos, 3 memos, one of which was to change the mechanism that we have been having on decision-making systems within the UN. He has established what's called executive committee. He very much wants to have a cabinet-style decision-making mechanism. So the executive committee chaired by the Secretary-General with principals of key organizations and departments, supported by deputies committee, again, of the relevant entities within the UN. On the same day, he also announced that he would like to take a look at various recommendations that have been made already on peace and security architecture. Again, going back to 2015, all the way through to 2016, there were a number of important reform processes. The high-level international panel on peace review of peace operations, it's called HIPPO report, and the Peacebuilding architecture review, 1320 review. So there are all these very important reform processes have produced good body of recommendations. So the SG has now set up an internal review team to take a look at those various reform measures and then task this internal review team to come to the Secretary-General by June options for restructuring of the peace and security architecture. He has also instructed, actually on day one, pending, of course, the recommendation for restructuring, he has already instructed DPKO, my old Department for Peacekeeping Operations, and Department of Political Affairs, to co-locate their regional divisions. So I used to be the director for Asia and Middle East division in DPKO, and I had a counterpart in DPA also, and then we were sitting far apart. So one of his first instruction was to co-locate physically those different divisions structurally, but looking at the same region to work together much more closely. That has actually, I think, created quite a shockwave for various reasons, but I think it was a very important, very early, quick decision that he has made. He has also said that UN development system reform is a very important initiative. This one has a legislative mandate. The QCPR of the General Assembly has instructed us, the Secretary General, to present in June and also in December 2 reports related to his vision for the reform of the UN development system. And I'll come back to touch on why it is important in the context of prevention. But the third stream of the reform is the management reform, which he would very much like to focus on. The kinds of rules and regulations that we have in the UN Secretariat is really no longer supporting our field operations, in peace operations. Those are the rules and regulations that were made to support the Secretariat role, to support the member states' discussions at the various legislative organs. But we still have to rely on those rules and regulations, in fact, to tackle the really acute crisis at the country level. So there is definitely a problem there. So that is also his priority agenda. He has also started a process of discussion with the member states on what he would like to create as a new architecture for counterterrorism. And of course, he has put forward the new way of working. This is an outcome of the World Humanitarian Summit, of bringing together the humanitarian and development communities much, much closer together, so that we will be able to address the protracted humanitarian needs, not by emergency measures, but much more strategically with the longer-term interventions. What will guide us is for us to be able to come up with what we call the collective outcome, rather than in terms of just the input. When there is acute food insecurity, like the famine situation that we're facing, we should not be only thinking in terms of how many metric tons of trucks of food that we need to send in, but we really have to look at what are underlying causes for the famine and start addressing those underlying causes on day one. So last week he organized a press conference, 2 weeks ago, and then beside him were Helen Clark, the chair of the UN Development Group, and Stephen O'Brien, the emergency relief coordinator. And he said that this time the famine will be addressed in a different way. It's the new way of working. And then the Copenhagen conference was how to actually make sure that this will become the norm. There are lots of new approaches being invented as we speak at the country level. So there are a lot of resident coordinators and humanitarian coordinators from the field situations, sharing their vision and their challenges and obstacles when they're trying to implement this new way of working. Now, prevention. He said that prevention is not merely a priority, but it is the priority. If you actually look at the international resources, most of the international resources in those issues are spent on response. And he would like to reverse that balance. We need to invest much, much more on prevention, simply because, it makes sense, because today's conflict is so difficult to resolve. It will be much better, it will make sense to invest more in the preventative phase so that it would not actually reach a crisis level. he has been talking about it's not just conflict, it is a broader crisis prevention. And there, of course, disaster risk reduction, investing in risk reduction actually makes sense. There is actually a statistics in every dollar that we invest in disaster risk reduction, there is actually yielding of $7. So economically speaking, it makes sense. We are cooperating with the World Bank to have a similar study. What are the longer-term structural prevention efforts by development interventions on conflict prevention? The World Bank is doing this study to look at those prevention areas. And we are on the board with a World Bank to look at steering the way for this, and then they are going to issue this study. I just heard in Copenhagen that they're going to issue this study in the margins of a General Assembly this year. I think there also it will make much more sense to prevent conflict rather than trying to respond and then do it in a protracted manner. So. This is the agenda. I think we are really looking at very exciting prospects. Again, I'm an optimist, but what I see, having worked for the UN for many, many years, is that we actually do have a lot of potential. We can do a lot more if we only put our heads together and then have a courage to change so that we will be able to deliver. One important thing I think we have to really come back to is leaving no one behind. Even in peace and security community, we have actually shifted, or we are in the process of shifting our paradigm much more to people-centric approach. Development cooperation, the same. We have been traditionally working with the government. We have been really focusing on institutions and institution buildings. But the recent SDG, have actually told us to really review those approaches, and we have to also become much more people-centric in terms of delivering the development impacts. So if we can put those efforts together, I'm pretty sure we can do a lot. We can achieve a lot. And then the good news is that we have a great leader at the UN today. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, extraordinary, Izumi. Well, you declare yourself an optimist, but you show also the other traits that are necessary for success in the UN, which is to be both realistic and creative. And there's, of course, there's almost no hole in the coherence and the solidness with which you explain the approach that is taking place. But let me almost on a lighter side ask, I was going to press you on Guterres, but you have given his agenda so richly. But how is it, more on a personal level? Because when you've walked in these corridors and seen the attitude that sometimes sits in the walls, is it different now?
Yes, I mean, atmosphere in the UN Secretariat has changed very much. I mean, I feel that we are really energized. If you see the Secretary General, issuing those memos on the first day in his office with a lot of ideas and setting in motion the processes to change, and then we have actually been talking about the need to change ourselves. So, for me, it's a great, really refreshing, and also, in the meetings, he has a lot of ideas himself. So I think the sense I get is that he is looking for senior officials who would not have to rely on talking points, but really having intellectual exchanges to try and find the way forward. That's a great energizing environment. Yeah. It's really great.
So he was at the UNHCR. But we're living in a world with quite a lot of anger and frustration, and at least in the global public dialogues, I'm not even sure one can call them dialogues sometimes, the confrontations between countries, within countries, you see a lot of anger. Surely that kind of confrontation exists intergovernmentally at the UN as well. Is that your experience, or is it different there? Is UN playing that framework role where dialogue actually reduces or increases the understanding?
Well, I mean, as I said, the Council has been, in the past few years already having very difficult time. Where they have the strategic differences of views, they are not able to, in fact, come to a solution. And then Syria is a case in point, but there are a few others. But at the same time, I also see, I can't really articulate it yet, because I think it is also relatively new. What I saw, for example, in the migration negotiations in the past 5 months is the traditional sort of, tensions between the North and the South, or the G77 versus, that did not apply to the migration debate. And of course, because of the issues, but I think there is a lot of scope to try and have a new intergovernmental dynamics crafted. We need to analyze it. We need to make sure that the emerging superpowers will also become really strong allies for us and for the Secretary-General. But
can you point to some? Because that's a very important question. It used to be that the friends of the UN were easily identified, and there was some who protected their, let's say, P5 as permanent 5 members of the Security Council interest, or in various ways had their stake in it. But people who are, or countries who are emerging now as creative players for new partnerships, for responsibility, for contributions, for financial contributions. Is that happening?
Yes. I mean, look at what China is doing. They have become a big contributor. I mean, they're the biggest contributor in terms of troops into peacekeeping operations. They're also setting up various trust funds to make the funds available for the United Nations. I think, those countries like Brazil, Indonesia, South Africa, those emerging future superpowers, they are all looking at what will be the policy agenda they can support. They all have perhaps different perspectives, but I think they do actually carry some interesting perspectives, which we need to really very carefully, discuss with them, and then turn them into, the big allies in the multilateralism.
It must have been a special moment to hear China articulate they were anyway staying in the Paris Treaty and will be a promoter of freer trade when we had the reversal the other month. Anyway, let's turn to the audience. We have another 15 minutes or so. Brief questions, please, and not any long statements, so that Izumi can get a chance to react to them. Microphones are coming here, and I'll pick up. There we go.
My name is Jorge Navarro, international correspondent. I would like to ask you about the post-truth framework and how you can reach migration component orderly, as you say, and dignified with the discourse that already is emerging in every place in the world, especially from these new leaders.
So profound, I think you need to answer
the migration,
that.
Yes.
Or the post-truth.
No, what I can tell you is what is going to happen in terms of all of us, the UN membership, leading up all the way to the 2018 migration conference. So they have agreed already to adopt the international global compact on international migration. And I think looking at the modalities negotiation the past couple of months, I think there was enough enthusiasm or enough momentum for member states to say that it should not be just a political declaration. No one believes that in 2018, which is just around the corner, by the way, it's just next week, next year, no one will be able to have a binding treaty-like agreement We don't have time for that, and then we don't have the environment for it. But there were enough governments represented at the UN who are saying that it should not be just a political declaration, that they would like to have something, a full commitment to what they're going to discuss from now on, and also with some sort of a follow-up or monitoring mechanism. So it's a very encouraging sign. Now, it will be very challenging. It's a very difficult issue. What's going to happen already in early May, we are starting what we call the thematic consultations, both in New York and in Geneva, and then also one in Vienna, along the 6 cluster of substantive issues related to migration. The first one actually is going to be in Geneva, related to human rights and social cohesions on migrants. And then it will be Louise Arbour who will be leading that kind of a debate. So, successful sort of consultations, both on the thematic issues and the regional consultations, hopefully will really strengthen the substance of the compact, which will be something beyond 2018, the international community can build on. Even if we cannot have a binding agreement, there is always a hope to go beyond that if you have a good, strong substance in the global compact. So, what I said to the SG in this portfolio is that the UN has to have longer-term vision going beyond 2018, and for me, that's why it's so important to have someone like Louise, who will come with such strong voice, a lot of authority, to be the advocate and the vision provider, if you will. So I am not entirely pessimistic, even though this is a hugely challenging agenda.
Thank you.
Okay, my name is Malchas Kakabadze. I'm from Georgian Embassy. There are many questions regarding UN, as far as I've been dealing with UN sometime in the beginning of 2000. But generally, I have one question, if you are able to respond, because it's not easy one. How do you see the future of UN? For example, from my perspective, I have quite a pessimistic opinion about it, in particular in the composition of present Security Council, because on our case, we became a victim of the, let's say, willingness of one of the permanent members. So it will continue forever, because I am not sure that this country will change their opinion regarding Georgia. But how do you see? Because I am not sure that even if we go a little bit far from the history, when UN was created or established, the goals and situation was absolutely different. And it's related to, sometimes I say that Cold War is not over. Maybe for some countries, yes, but for my country, it's not. So how do you see the future of UN? I think that it needs radical changes.
Thank you.
I wish I could give an answer to that. It's
Give a brief
yes.
one.
I think everyone probably agrees that the Security Council somehow has to change, but it is a member states issue. I mean, there will have to be, enough political momentum to change the composition or expand the Security Council. And there have been a lot of discussions taking place. It appears that, the time has not actually come yet. But everyone at least recognizes that something has to happen on the Security Council.
The practice of the Security Council has changed quite a bit.
Yes. Well, the strategic divisions by the P5, etc., that is also definitely there. One thing, if I could actually say, I mean, the Secretary-General is now much more directly engaging the Security Council. This is one thing that I just, observe sitting in New York. I mean, I think it was in his first week when he spoke at the Swedish presidency meeting on the Sustaining Peace agenda. He has much more, direct engagement. He wants to definitely work much, much more closely with the Security Council so that we will be the UN Secretariat. By the way, Secretary-General, the Secretariat of the UN, is not just a secretariat, it's an organ. It's one of the organs of the UN. So UN actually is a very unique international organization.
And who organized that, if not Dag Hammarskjöld? Well, let's go on with a few more questions, if you allow, Izumi. One up here.
Hello, my name is Maria. I'm a law student from Stockholm University. And I saw peacekeeping as an important contributor to peace in Côte d'Ivoire, for example. So I was wondering if one wants to encourage the usage of more peacekeeping preventively where there are difficult situations, how would you advise on how to start cooperation to increase peacekeeping in different countries? Like, if I am Swedish, where would I start? Asking the government of Sweden to initiate this at the Security Council, or is there other? Yeah, thank you.
Of course, peacekeeping is an issue that is very close to my heart because I worked in peacekeeping department for 8 years or so. It is part of SG's reform agenda to also address some of the issues that have been giving bad name to peacekeeping, namely sexual exploitation and abuse issues. The SG is putting together a game-changing strategy to really eliminate those horrific scandals, which gives really bad name to peacekeeping. I think also we need to review what are the real contributions that we can make through peacekeeping operations. There is a terminology called Christmas tree mandates. Until about 2-3 years ago, there was a tendency on the part of the Security Council to put so much into peacekeeping mandates, the tasks under the Security Council mandate resolution that gives the mandate to peacekeeping. In a way, peacekeeping has to rethink again in this kind of really complex environment, what are the real good things that they can contribute through means of peacekeeping operations? We keep saying that peacekeeping is not a military operation, and I really truly believe that. Peacekeeping is a political mission for UN with troops available for stabilization tasks, for protection of civilians. But it is being challenged at the moment. And the examples are South Sudan, DRC, Mali, etc.
Not to speak of the lessons from Afghanistan. There was a question here.
My name is Catalina Uribe. I'm a program officer for International IDEA, so your former organization. I have two questions. One is regarding the implementation of this agenda on prevention, which is very encouraging, but some of the people who are skeptical point out, for example, the challenge with regards to, for example, investment and how countries, member states are often driven by, well, the crisis, and that's what voters are often sort of paying attention to, not the countries where crises are not taking place. So how to go about that, and also sort of the multiplicity of the contributing factors to conflict, which then people point out that some of those agendas regarding development factors or organized crime, some of the things you already mentioned are already tackled by some of the other current policy agendas. So that is not sort of, in a way, already taken care of. Yep. And thirdly, the sort of political sensitivities of dealing with some of the political elements of that preventive approach, which in a way have been part of the reason why the UN oftentimes sort of shies away, because these are very politically sensitive topics to work on when it comes to elections or political parties and other sort of the governmental institutions that are may be fragile. So how to go about that? And the second question has to do with sort of four. Well, it was just one with three elements.
Okay, go on, please.
No, but the last one on sort of also the threats to democracy and how those, current, just to name threats, could also jeopardize some of these current developments.
Thank you very much.
Well, you put a lot of questions there. I think one thing that is very important to remember here is that Secretary General does not, when he talks about prevention, he is not just talking about short-term diplomatic preventive or political preventive efforts. In fact, he is really placing development cooperation at the center of this prevention debate. I mean, in a sense, when things get really bad already, and then, for example, try to deploy military forces to prevent clashes, in a way, we have almost half or two-thirds of the way failed in prevention. So we have to really look at longer-term structural prevention efforts through development investment. And while the development actors actually argue that everything that we have been doing contributes to prevention, I think we have to go one or two or three steps further. We need to really articulate what works and what does not really work in terms of development, structural prevention investment. What are the areas, the kinds of things that we should be targeting? Development in the past 10 years, more, probably 20 years, have been always really targeting institutions, institutional capacity building. Is it enough, or are there anything else that we should be targeting through development cooperation? What are the things that we need to actually do better in terms of really using the development resources to have much more direct prevention effect? Those are the kinds of questions that we need to be really asking ourselves, and that's partly the World Bank study on prevention with which we're cooperating. So it's again, for development cooperation, a little bit of a paradigm shift that we need to have. That's why he keeps saying that UN development system reform is key for prevention agenda.
So we're coming to the end of this brief conversation. I want to just throw, this kind of short, impossible to answer question to you. At the very end, usually you ask, well, where do you think your particular area or your challenge will be in 10 years? Well, given the uncertainty of this world, I'll just ask you to speak about in 1 year. Where do you think we will have come with multilateralism or the rule of law seen from your angle in New York?
In 1 year? Well, I think the migration debates, the human mobility issue,
or any perspective you would like to, pick up.
Will continue to be, one of the key challenges for the international community for years to come. Climate change is not going to disappear, definitely. How to actually, and then those things actually are contributing to today's conflict picture. Everything is actually related. So we need to tackle some of those mega trends. And there are also some emerging issues like cybersecurity. I mean, those are the issues that I know nothing about. But I think the UN will need to really start to understand some of the emerging issues, because if people are starting to talk about it now, that means in 5 years from now it will actually feature as a key challenge for the international community.
So despite the negative trends in the world, the UN will take its place, partly thanks to people like you, Izumi. Thanks for spending time with us.
Thank you.